He intimately exploits his maid and has a child with her until the day he realizes she is his biological daughter. Richard came home later than usual. His shirt still reeked of alcohol as he walked through the dark hallway of the large house. Mayim, his wife, was fast asleep in their marital bedroom, exhausted from a day of meetings and silent frustration. They had been married for 17 years without children, and every night she fell asleep with the weight of that absence. In the kitchen, Grace, the young maid, was putting away utensils after cleaning. She worked discreetly, always with her eyes lowered, as if trying to blend into the walls. But Richard had noticed her. Too much. For weeks, he had been approaching her with ambiguous gestures and heavy gazes. He stopped at the kitchen entrance, his voice low, almost hoarse. "Grace?" She flinched, pretending to focus on drying a plate. "Yes, Mr. Richard." He came closer, his breath heavy. "You know everything you have is because of me. Without me, you'd go back to your village, empty-handed. Understand?" She didn't respond, her eyes misty. She knew these moments. She knew he would take advantage of her silence again. She wanted to run, but she thought of her sick mother, her little brother who depended on her help. So she endured. That night, Richard crossed a line no father, protector, or honorable man should ever cross. He forcibly violated his maid. The next morning, Mayim came down to the dining room, impeccable in her cream-colored suit. She cast a distracted glance at Richard, who was sipping his coffee. "Richard, don't forget our doctor's appointment tomorrow. I want to restart the treatments. I can't stand the family's whispers anymore." Richard nodded without enthusiasm, as always. He hid his weariness poorly. The doctors had mentioned infertility, but he had never accepted that word. In his mind, he wasn't the problem. A few weeks later, one morning, Grace vomited in the sink before starting her chores. Her hands trembled, the signs were clear. She was pregnant. That evening, alone in her small room at the back of the courtyard, she spoke to herself, her voice breaking. "What am I going to do with this child? I can't. My mistress Mayim will kill me." She burst into sobs. The weight of the secret suffocated her, but she knew one thing. Running wasn't an option. Meanwhile, Mayim, still unaware, prayed every night. She placed her hands on her empty womb and whispered to God, "Lord, give me just one child, even one. Show me I'm not barren." Unknowing that her husband had already sown a forbidden pregnancy in their home. One foggy morning, as birds began to sing in the courtyard trees, Grace vomited again behind the house. Her body trembled, her heart racing. She now knew she was carrying a child. Not just any child, but Richard's, her employer. Hours later, wandering, she knelt on the damp earth, clutching her still flat stomach. Tears streamed down her face. "God, why me? Why in this house?" she whispered. That evening she entered the kitchen, pale. Richard came up behind her as usual, confident in his power. But this time, Grace looked him in the eyes and said, in a weak but firm voice, "Mr. Richard, I'm carrying your child." Richard froze. His eyes widened as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say?" "I'm pregnant with your child." Richard stepped forward abruptly, clutching his temples as if going mad. "You can't say that. You want to ruin my home? Destroy my reputation?" Grace stepped back, tears in her eyes. "I didn't ask for this. You forced me, night after night. I never wanted this." Richard slammed both hands on the table, breathing heavily. After a long silence, he spoke in a harsh voice. "No one must know. Not Mayim, not the neighbors. If you want to stay here, you keep quiet." He left her with that threat hanging. The next morning, Mayim noticed Grace looked unwell. She frowned, concerned. "Grace, you're pale. Have you eaten?" "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied, lowering her eyes. Mayim placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're like a daughter to me. If something's wrong, tell me." Those words pierced Grace's heart like a knife. She felt her stomach and looked away, unable to respond. Months passed. Every night Grace cried alone in her small room. Her belly was rounding, noticeable under her work clothes. She avoided Mayim's gaze, avoided questions. Richard, meanwhile, ensured his wife noticed nothing but a growing fear gnawed at him. One evening, Mayim entered the kitchen and caught Grace caressing her belly. "Grace, what's this? You're pregnant?" Silence fell like a stone. Grace lowered her eyes. Mayim trembled, her voice breaking. "Who's the man? Who did this?" Before Grace could answer, Richard burst in. "Mayim, it's not what you think." Mayim turned to him, her face contorted with anger and pain. "Richard, don't tell me you're the man behind this." Richard found no words. His silence spoke louder than any confession. Mayim let out a cry, collapsing into a chair, breathless. "God has abandoned me. 17 years without a child, and you make one with the maid in this house?" The house filled with oppressive silence. Mayim wept all night while Grace stayed locked in her room, overwhelmed by shame and fear. The following months were heavy, tense, unbearable. Mayim could barely tolerate Grace's presence but didn't send her away. She watched Grace's belly grow, a cruel mirror of her own emptiness. One morning after a stormy night, Grace screamed in pain. Labor had begun. Mayim, despite her broken heart, was the first to rush to her room. She placed a towel on the bed and gave instructions to the neighbors who had been called. Richard, trembling in the living room, waited, unable to move. Grace's screams echoed through the night until a small cry of a baby finally broke the silence. A fragile infant was born in that house. Mayim was the first to hold it. Her tears fell on the newborn's forehead. She whispered, "Lord, why this miracle and pain? This child I could never give my husband, the maid carries it." Richard entered slowly, looked at the child, and clenched his fists. A storm was already raging in his soul. But a more terrible truth lay dormant, invisible, ready to surface one day. Months passed, and the situation only worsened. Mayim, consumed by anger and betrayal, withdrew into icy silence. She couldn't bear to see Grace in the house or meet her husband's gaze, as Richard increasingly avoided her. The baby's birth had only added poison to their already fragile relationship. The next day, Grace entered the kitchen. Little Chijoke, now a few months old, slept in his cradle beside her. She prepared a meal for Mayim, who watched her with growing distance but always present. Mayim entered the kitchen with heavy steps. She observed Grace silently, then broke the silence with an icy tone. "You seem to be doing fine. The baby's no longer a burden." Grace, hands trembling, lowered her eyes. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for all this. I didn't want it. It wasn't up to me. You think that's enough? You think your apologies can fix what you've done to my husband? To me?" Mayim's voice was sharp, each word like a dagger. She approached Grace, her gaze filled with contempt. "You really think we can forget you stole my daughter's place?" Grace flinched. The blow was brutal, but she stayed silent. She had learned to make herself small, to endure insults and blame. Mayim's gaze was that of a woman devoured by resentment, and Grace sometimes wondered if her spirit would break under the pressure. Mayim didn't let up. She continued, "Look at yourself. You think Richard loved you? That it was just a mistake? No. He used you, and you let him. You were the tool of my degradation, and you didn't even have the decency to spare me." She turned on her heels but added before leaving, "Don't you dare look at me with that pretense. You're nothing." Grace felt crushed, the unbearable weight of pain on her shoulders. She collapsed for a moment, tears flowing freely. Chijoke, though small, always looked at her with innocent eyes, as if nothing in the world could break his calm. But Grace knew that innocence wouldn't last. She had to protect him. Over the months, the tension in the house became unbearable. Richard seemed incapable of fixing anything. He had tried, of course, to calm Mayim, but each day he saw his marriage crumbling. The love, or rather dependence, he felt for Grace had become a growing shadow between him and his wife. He avoided coming home, finding excuses to spend time elsewhere, at work or out of town. But each time, guilt consumed him. The worst was that Mayim understood everything but refused to speak. She felt the betrayal in her own home, but chose to focus her hatred on Grace, giving the young woman no respite. There were days when Mayim made her work harder than usual, forcing her into endless, exhausting chores to remind her of her place. She never missed a chance to make Grace feel she was nothing more than a maid, even though she carried her husband's child. One evening, as Grace was alone with the baby in the garden, Mayim approached Chijoke and stared at him for a long time. Then, in a cold tone, she said, "You know, this little one will never give you back the place you stole. He'll grow up, and one day he'll know. He'll know who you really are. You're just a mistake in Richard's life." Grace stood slowly, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "He's innocent, ma'am. He didn't ask for any of this. This is between you two?" Mayim sneered, stepped closer, and cruelly caressed Grace's cheek. "Do you really think there won't be consequences? That you can hide behind excuses as if they'll erase the truth? One day the child will have questions, and trust me, I'll be there to remind him who you are. I'll be there to show him how he was conceived. Maybe you should start thinking about what you'll do when the truth comes out, when you face your own reality." Grace didn't lower her eyes this time. She knew she couldn't change Mayim's hatred, but her heart broke a little more each day. She realized she wasn't just an object to Richard and Mayim, but that her own child, Chijoke, would grow up in a house haunted by pain, betrayal, and guilt. The next day, Richard came home late after visiting colleagues at a bar. He didn't even notice his wife wasn't in the house. Mayim had disappeared, a strategy she had learned to inflict pain. Every time he returned, she vanished, leaving him alone with his disgust. Grace approached him, holding the baby. She observed him for a moment before speaking. "Sir, the baby needs to see a doctor. He's showing worrying symptoms." Richard, distracted, stared into the void. "What? He's sick?" He approached, his voice tense. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Grace lowered her eyes, unable to respond. Everything had become too heavy. Each day she sank deeper into a spiral of anxiety, knowing Mayim hated her more and more. But for Chijoke, she kept going, even if everything seemed to stand in the way of her happiness. The days stretched into a long thread of pain and resentment. Grace, though still young, carried the burden of a life marked by betrayal and shame. But there was still a glimmer of hope in her. Her sick mother, back in the village, and her little brother, Emeka, depended on her to send money for their survival. Each month, she sent a modest sum to her mother, hoping it would help her recover. But with the pregnancy and the difficulties in Richard's house, her resources were depleted. She exhausted herself working from morning to night, and whenever she could, she isolated herself to write letters to her mother. Those words, filled with pain and promises, wove a fragile thread of connection. In Richard's house, life was a daily battle. Mayim, increasingly bitter and resentful, spared Grace nothing. Every day she found new reasons to belittle her. She gave her no rest, no compassion, just cold hatred. Mayim knew she could never recover what she saw as her own defeat, but she found satisfaction in making Grace's life a living hell. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, Grace received a letter from her mother and read the hastily written words. "My dear Grace, I am tired. My heart aches every night I spend without your help. Emeka is growing fast, but we have so little. I know you're doing everything for us, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm causing you more pain by asking for money. I'm writing to tell you not to worry, but I think my time is running out. I love you and pray for you every day. Do what your heart tells you. I love you." Grace's breath caught. She collapsed to the floor, clutching the letter to her chest, sobbing. Her mother, her only emotional support, was dying, and she could do nothing. But in this house, under Mayim's watchful eye, finding a moment of peace was impossible. Grace had to keep up appearances, stay silent, and play the role of the obedient servant, even if it was killing her bit by bit. Each day she grew more exhausted, but she had no choice. She had to keep working to send money to her mother and protect Chijoke. One evening, as Richard returned late, Mayim caught Grace crying in the kitchen, hands covering her face. "Crying again?" Mayim shouted, her voice filled with cold rage. "You think your misery moves me? You're nothing. You destroyed my life, and now you cry like a child. What do you expect? Pity?" Grace quickly wiped her tears and stood. She knew responding was pointless. Mayim only wanted to inflict more pain. But this time, In a moment of desperation, Grace spoke in a faint, almost inaudible voice. "My mother is dying, Mayim. I have no more money for her. And Amika needs care too. I don't know what to do." Mayim's gaze hardened. "Why didn't you get an abortion then? Why didn't you get rid of that child instead of letting it remind me every day of the shame you caused?" Grace's heart clenched at those words. She lowered her head, unable to respond. The following days, the tension in the house escalated. Richard decided to leave for a business trip, hoping it would ease the atmosphere. But before leaving, he turned to Grace. "I'll be gone for a few days. Don't do anything stupid. I know you have no loyalty to my wife, but there are limits." Grace's cold gaze answered without words. She knew that even in his absence, Richard would keep an eye on her. And indeed, the days passed, and the situation worsened. Her mother's illness grew more complicated, while Grace found herself more alone than ever in the large house. She was the maid who served, cleaned, and cared for the child. But no one saw her inner struggles. Mayim watched her constantly, waiting for the slightest mistake to punish her. Grace felt increasingly suffocated by the weight of her responsibilities and the guilt of not being able to do more for her family. One night, as she returned to her room after a final round in the house, Grace noticed a light on in the living room. Mayim was there, alone, staring at something invisible but clearly consumed by contained rage. Grace hesitated but finally approached. She knew speaking to her mistress was never a good idea, but something pushed her to try. "Ma'am, I wanted to tell you I sent money to my mother. Despite everything, I'm sorry this has ruined everything we had." Mayim, with a cruel smile, said, "You think money will fix what you've done?" Grace lowered her eyes, feeling crushed under the pressure. "I'm doing my best. You'd better not make waves, because when Richard returns, I can't guarantee he'll be blind enough not to see the truth. You're just a number in my life, and you'll end up disappearing." Grace took a deep breath, turning to leave the room. But before going, she whispered, barely audible, "I have no choice, ma'am. Not here or in the village." Months had passed since Richard left for his business trip. But deep down, he knew what awaited him upon his return wouldn't be as simple as he hoped. The tension in the house was palpable, and Mayim's forced taunts couldn't mask the anxiety reigning between her and Grace. But the worst was the constant pressure on Grace. Her heart, torn between her duty to the baby, her role as a maid, and her mother's suffering in the village, didn't know where to turn. That night, after hearing the sound of a car engine pulling into the courtyard, Mayim rose from her armchair. She knew Richard would be there in a few minutes. That evening, she had a plan. The psychological war against Grace was crossing a darker threshold, and what she had planned would expose the truth once and for all. When Richard entered the house, he was tired, but something in the atmosphere disturbed him immediately. Mayim stood in the living room, her gaze icy, while Grace remained silent in the kitchen. He knew her, but that night, he sensed something different, as if a cloud had formed between them. Mayim didn't even bother to greet him with a kiss. She simply stared at him with unprecedented coldness and said in a low voice, "I'm tired of all this. I can't stand living in this house with a woman who has disfigured our lives, a woman who destroys what's left of us." Richard rubbed his eyes, confused. "Mayim, what are you talking about?" "What I'm talking about, Richard, is that everything you think you know about this house, about Grace, about everything, it's all a lie. She's not what she claims to be. She's not just a maid, Richard. And you let this happen." Richard's heart tightened, thinking Mayim had had enough, that this was just another of her outbursts. But suddenly, Mayim approached him and handed him a paper envelope, a folded document she had carefully hidden in a drawer. Richard looked at it, confused. "Open it," she said imperiously. Hesitant, Richard tore open the envelope. He pulled out an old photo, one he hadn't seen in years. He studied it for a moment, then turned to Mayim, worried. "This is a photo of my first wife." Mayim smiled cynically. "Yes, a photo of the woman you forgot, the woman you abandoned, who gave you a child. Look closely at the photo. Richard, Grace is your daughter." Richard's breath stopped. He didn't understand. "You're talking nonsense, Mayim. Grace, my daughter?" But Mayim approached slowly, her gaze piercing. "It's her, Richard. your own flesh and blood. She was entrusted to your brother's house after you left with your lover. But she grew up. She served you. She did everything you asked. And you exploited her without knowing who she was. Richard's world shattered. His eyes widened in terror. He had never imagined the story could be so horrific. Grace was his daughter, the child of his first wife. But he had gone so far in his desire for control and power that he never saw the truth unfolding before him. The child he had taken for a mere maid, the one he had abused, was his own flesh. Mayim, seeing the shock on Richard's face, drove the point home. I'm sorry for you, Richard, but she's your daughter. And everything you've done, everything you've tried to hide, is now in the open. The child she carries is yours too, isn't it? But she couldn't tell you because you refused to see the truth. Richard began to tremble. He turned slowly toward the kitchen door, searching for Grace. She stood there motionless, her eyes full of tears. The last threads of her dignity were breaking at that moment. Richard approached her slowly and, in a broken voice, whispered, Grace, is it you? Are you my daughter? She nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Yes, Papa. It's me. Those two words echoed in the room like a thunderclap. The ground beneath their feet seemed to collapse. Richard sank into a chair, his heart shattered. Memories of his first wife, the moments he had fled that family, came rushing back in a whirlwind of regret. He had lost his family, and now he faced the horrific reality of what he had done. Mayim, standing in the corner of the room, watched Richard with cold satisfaction, as if she knew this truth would destroy him forever. Richard looked at Grace, his gaze devastated. I'm sorry. I never wanted this, Grace. I used you. I hurt your mother and you. I didn't know. His words faded in his throat. Grace, with all the dignity she had left, turned to him, her eyes filled with pain and defiance. You never wanted to know, Richard. You never wanted to see who I really was. Neither me, nor my mother, nor my brother ever mattered to you. It was always about you, your needs, your desires. Now you know, but this is just a glimpse of what we've been through. The next day, Mayim was gone. The wind carried away her cruel words, and Richard, now confronted with the most terrible truth of his life, realized he could never erase what he had done. He had destroyed his own family without ever understanding the consequences of his actions. Part 2. Exclusively if the YouTube community overwhelmingly demands the continuation of the story. Thank you. Amen.